I've been asked why Black History Month is still important and why it should be taught by a Black historian. Black History Month is still important, especially in 2020, because a lot of people, including African American students, don't know the history of African Americans in this country. And I think it's important for all people to know the story, because there has been a narrative that Black people were just slaves, and then there was Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. However, there's a history of African Americans that goes far beyond just those two ideas. When the first slaves came in 1619, many of them, and we don't call them slaves anymore, enslaved people, because that wasn't just their identity, but they were strong people who endured a system that never should have happened. And I think it's important for people to see the long history, the bravery, the different things that Black people did to survive, the culture they created, and how they have survived into 2020 America.
African American history is important because it allows us to talk about many of the present conditions in which both African Americans and others live in the United States. Many of the issues, whether it is police brutality, whether it is stop and frisk, whether it is many of the policies that African Americans go through, many of these are steeped in the traditions of segregation, dehumanization, enslavement of Black people. And so by teaching African American history and talking about it, particularly in a classroom setting, it allows us to engage present day discussions in a professional, historical manner that you cannot get when you're just simply throwing out things on social media. And so I think it is really healthy, not just for Black people, but for people of all ethnic backgrounds to come together and talk about Black history in a setting that allows for healthy and wholesome discussion. To the question of why is it important that an African American teach African American history, I love teaching African American history as an African American because I can bring a life experience into that classroom that opens up questions, not just for African American students, but for other students to ask me. And for many of my students, I'm the first person of color that they've ever been taught by. And so what that allows is for a discussion for people to engage in that is safe. And there are questions that non-African Americans have had on their minds that they've been wanting to ask an African American, and being in the classroom allows me to open up that space for them to do just that. And for my African American students, I try to model for them that when you get into difficult discussions, this is how someone responds in a way that is not inflammatory or derogatory, but demonstrates respect for oneself and for those on the other side of the question.
Black history's importance comes into being a Black person, growing up, and not necessarily having many opportunities to study people like me in school. And so becoming a history faculty member gave me the opportunity to share these stories that I thought were so interesting and unique, and that were not only reflective of me, but that so many people, regardless of where they come from or who they look like, could really relate to. And so for me, the importance of teaching African American history as someone who has, built their career around the study of people of color, is that African American history offers an opportunity to learn about the U.S., right? If we're talking about Black people in the U.S., an opportunity to learn about the U.S. from a different vantage point and perspective. And in doing so, you learn about different ways that a particular group has engaged in cultural production. You learn about what politics means from their perspective. You learn about what community and food and culture, right? You learn so many different unique aspects of a particular segment of society by learning about African American history.